Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am just going to dive right in. We have quite a few questions popping up already, and I know we have a lot to cover today, so I want to welcome you all and welcome our speakers, Camille, Janice, and Arlene. Today, we will be talking about COVID-19 vaccinations and what California's employers need to know about them. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items for the style of what our meeting is like today. This is a webinar setting. Therefore, as audience members, you are on mute and you do not have access to your cameras. However, you may use the chat feature, or there is a Q&A button located in your black menu bar where you may ask the speakers your questions throughout or after the duration of the webinar. With that, I am going to pass it over to Janice, who is going to introduce us, our firm Myers-Nave, herself and our speakers, and what we have on topic for today.
Good morning, everyone, or good mid-morning. I'm really excited to host this conversation because it's a very interesting and timely topic. As Stephanie said, my name is Janice Brown, and I'm a partner with the Labor and Employment section of Myers-Nave. And I'm very fortunate to have my partners with me today, Camille and Arlene, who are true experts in helping us understand this timely issue. So we have a combination of a pandemic, you have people's reactions to the pandemic, and then you have the law that infuses all of those topics. And here's what we're going to try to find out is have these experts on COVID lead us through this minefield. We read about it in the papers, but we're going to help you understand the issues. And so the next slide, please. So here are the folks that you are going to be hearing from, me to some degree to monitor the questions and also to ask any questions. If you have them in the chat, I'll do my best to moderate those. But I'm very pleased to introduce you to Camille and Arlene, who've done a lot of work to help us get educated on this very thorny issue. So with that, let me turn it over to my colleagues. Next slide. So we're going to do this in a poll. So look at these questions, and for your organization, this is all anonymous, so don't worry that you're committing to your organization to anything that you might not know, but just answer the question so we can see where people are with respect to what type of policy you have with respect to vaccinations in your organization. And this won't be weighted by us panelists because we can't vote. Okay, so let me give you guys can see the answers. There's few folks that have mandatory, quite a few have voluntary, and the majority is we don't know yet. Well, we're glad you're here because we're going to try to help you understand. Next slide. Is this you, Camille?
Excuse me. Okay, so some of the things that we'll be talking about today. Can you make the vaccine mandatory? So this is the $10,000 question, the most frequently asked question that we have, or should you? And we'll be going over some of the concerns and considerations that employers, both public and private employers, need to be thinking about in terms of anticipating putting together a vaccine policy. These include privacy issues. We'll talk about some analogies of how vaccines have been treated in other situations, other industries, other types of illnesses and regulations. We'll talk about some alternatives to mandatory vaccination policies, including incentive programs, in particular for private employers, and education programs for both public and private employers. And we'll also talk a little bit about some of the practical considerations that should be considered as you decide what is the correct pathway for your organization, and also as we together continue to monitor this rapidly changing landscape of the laws that are impacting vaccination policies. Next slide.
So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a setting the table here about where we are right now. Of course, as you know, there have been 446,000 people that have been killed by COVID within 1 year. And one bright spot is that we have this new vaccine. We have approximately 7.4% of Californians have received at least one dose. We're trying to get to the point where we have something that's called herd immunity, which means that enough people have been vaccinated or are immune through infection that it doesn't spread. So just to give you a quick example about measles, in the 1960s, they began a mass vaccination plan, and by 2000, measles were considered eradicated in the United States. However, there were a number of parents who stopped vaccinating their children. And then in 2014, someone came to Disneyland who was infectious with measles. Typically, if you have a situation where one person's infected, everyone around them is immune, so the outbreak ends there. And this person over here who, for some reason, maybe they're a child or they can't, they have some medical condition that doesn't allow them to get vaccinated, the disease is not going to spread to them because everyone that person who's infected is exposed to is already immune. But if people are unvaccinated, then the vulnerable people who can't get vaccinated may develop the disease. So what we're trying to do is understand, get enough people who are immune to the disease so that outbreaks are tamped down. But of course, this is a new disease and we're still learning a lot. We don't know if vaccinated individuals can still transmit COVID. We don't know if these new scary mutations of the COVID are going to be the vaccine is going to be effective against them. So we have a lot of questions still. And so one thing that we do know for sure for now is that vaccination is just going to be one strategy that employers are going to have to continue to use. So for the foreseeable future, we're still going to need masks, we're going to still need social distancing. And we have to also this is going to be a theme throughout our presentation. Things are going to be changing, so we just have to be nimble and keep on top of what the changes. So we can go to the next slide. And now Camille's going to talk on the next section.
Okay, can we make the vaccine mandatory and should we? As I said, the most frequently asked question that we receive from clients. And the poll results were, I think, very illustrative of what I've seen, in particular with respect to public clients. So many of you are reporting that you are looking at the issue, maybe don't have a policy in place yet. Those who are implementing policies tend to be shying away from mandatory. Most are voluntary. And we're going to be talking about some of the issues that are going to be impacting these decisions, whether you adopt a mandatory policy, a voluntary policy, or some other kind of outreach or education program. We're going to be talking about the types of issues that will be impacting that decision for your organization to make. Next slide. Here is an example of a real mandatory policy for an employer. The policy is after everyone is eligible and has the opportunity to get vaccinated, every employee must show proof of vaccination to go into the office or to attend office events.
So we have another questionnaire for you. Again, this is anonymous. So just give us what you think.
Is it okay? Yes, no, I don't know. And as you're voting, okay, well, no wins almost by 2-1. No and I don't know are the no and I don't know together probably represent a very significant majority. I guess maybe I could have named this slide, find all of the things that are wrong with this policy. I think the real value of this particular policy for me is that it illustrates and highlights so many areas that we're going to be talking about of things that are not considered areas that are pitfalls for employers as you consider what kind of a policy to have. So what's wrong here? First, there's no differentiation between essential and non-essential workers. And I didn't give you, in fairness, I didn't give you the whole policy, but I will tell you that in the entire policy, that differentiation doesn't exist. Second, the issue about requiring you must show proof of vaccination. This triggers a number of privacy concerns, which we're going to be talking about in this presentation that are particularly problematic for us in California, where privacy law is very strong. Third, the possibility of creating two groups of employees or segregating your workforce between those who are allowed in the office and those who are not allowed because of vaccine status sets a stage for disparate treatment of employees that can translate in various ways and easily become violations of the Fair Employment Housing Act or the ADA. Fourth, we see no accommodation possibilities in the policy. And as I said, I didn't show you the whole thing, but there's no accommodations for disabilities or for religious objections or other objections, which my colleague Arlene is going to be discussing in this presentation. And finally, perhaps most importantly, there's no indication in the policy of a direct threat to health and safety by the non-vaccinated individuals. And this is something that we'll be discussing a little bit more in detail. This is, I'll tell you, for a business that is an office-related business. It's not a business, where the employees have to work in a very close proximity to each other, where the chances of infection would be heightened. So I guess the takeaway for employers from this slide is this is how not to do a vaccine policy. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. This law was passed in 1938. And to understand the applicability of it to our current vaccine situation, you need to understand that the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines were not approved or licensed through the FDA's standard approval process. Instead, under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, because there was a public health emergency declared because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the FDA granted what is known as an emergency use authorization for the COVID vaccines. And what this means is that all of the descriptive materials, the advertising, the promotional materials relating to the use of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are required to say that the product hasn't been approved or licensed by the FDA, but it's been authorized by an emergency use. And that the emergency use is authorized only for the duration of the declaration. In other words, the emergency use authorization is valid only for that period of the declaration. And so under this statute, individuals who receive the vaccine have to be informed that they have the option to refuse the product. And the right of refusal under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is complicated in that although the statute provides a right of refusal, it doesn't provide any process for dealing with accommodating people who refuse or how such people are to be treated. It's an issue because as long as individuals have a right to refuse vaccines based on their emergency use authorization status, we can't say that a policy can be mandated in the sense of forcing people to get shots. But this is an issue currently when the emergency use authorization goes away, if it's revoked, or if the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines ultimately receive full licensure from the FDA through its standard process, which they're in that process now, then this objection would go away. But it's something that all employers need to be cognizant of. And now Arlene is going to discuss accommodation issues with respect to the EEOC guidance.
Right, thank you, Camille. So the next area is the EEOC. I think most employers have probably heard that in December, the EEOC issued guidance regarding vaccinations and reasonable accommodations. So that guidance suggested that if there's a direct threat from the unvaccinated individual, employers can mandate that employees be vaccinated. It's silent regarding this emergency use authorization issue. So that may play out in the courts at some point. But just to review what the guidance said, it just made clear that if you're going to have these types of mandates, that employers still need to consider reasonable accommodations for disability and religion. And the process is very similar to any other reasonable accommodation process, which is going to require individualized assessment, interactive process, and determining whether you can accommodate. So these could be, just having the person continue to work from home and not come into the workplace. And if, or there could be other things just requiring masking. There are different things in it. This is going to be an issue that is really dependent on the type of work the person's doing, the type of work environment. And so when we were planning this, we were talking about, well, can we just draft a policy? But it's going to be so individualized that one size is not going to fit all in these situations. So if we can go to the next slide. So, and the only exceptions here are for disability and sincerely held religious beliefs, which would be typically what we consider religion. There's no exception for just a strongly held belief against vaccinations that is provided under the guidance. And then I think we can just go on to the next slide. It's right, so that's what I had mentioned. If the objection is not based on religion or disability, the EEOC provides no exceptions for someone who just has a strongly held religious belief. And I'll talk a little bit later about how these kind of exceptions have been used in other situations. So there's a question about, it seems subjective to what means a sincerely held religious belief. And those types of issues have been litigated in the past. So you can have, there's some legal tests that you can find to see if there's a sincerely held religious belief. We know that certain religions already believe, for example, in the power of prayer over medical treatment. So some of these issues have been litigated in the past, and we can help you to assess whether this could be a religious exception or not. And then we can go on to the next slide. I think next we're going to have Camille is going to talk about issues, especially that our public employers face.
So for those of you who have unions and have MOUs, any public agencies who are wanting to implement a requirement for a vaccine or a vaccine policy will need to comply with the bargaining obligations that are set forth under the Myers-Milius-Brown Act. So the MMBA requires public agencies to provide notice and an opportunity for the unions to bargain on any decision that, number one, relates to a matter within the scope of representation, and number two, agencies have to do this before making such a decision. So under the MMBA, you have to meet and confer with your unions until you either reach agreement or reach impasse. And then at that point, you need to go through impasse procedures. So currently, the Public Employee Relations Board, or PERB, has not issued any guidance or any decisional precedent on requirements for COVID vaccinations of represented employees. And given the absence of any guidance or decisional precedent, the safest course at this point is for employers to assume that a vaccine policy is within the scope of bargaining and that you need to meet and confer with your unions before implementing any of those decisions. Now, I understand there have been there's quite a bit of discussion about exceptions to the scope of bargaining rule. And there are two exceptions that have been discussed in this context. One is an emergency exception. So the MMBA provides public agencies with a limited type of exception in situations that require an immediate administrative action to make a decision about something in the scope of representation before providing the unions with notice. But after that state of emergency is over, then you have to meet and confer. It's unknown whether PERB would look at this pandemic situation as meeting the exception for the emergency, because usually emergency exemptions have been invoked in situations of financial emergency. You know, like a city or county is facing some imminent financial hardship, bankruptcy or something of that level, or extreme financial hardship. And that's when that exception has been invoked. Has not up to now been utilized for a pandemic type of a situation. Another exception is the necessity exception. The scope of representation under the MMBA does not include, quote, consideration of the merits, necessity, or organization of any services provided by law. So the argument would be that a vaccination requirement could be viewed as outside the scope of bargaining because of necessity. But again, we don't see any precedent for that. So at this point, although those exceptions have been discussed, the safer course is still to assume that this will be viewed as within the scope of representation and to proceed accordingly. I also want to add for private employers, we see the same with the NLRA, that we don't see any decisional precedent from the NLRB. Generally speaking, PERB tends to be more employee-oriented than the NLRB, although of course it's anticipated now with the Biden administration making appointments going forward that the NLRB will become, the appointments to the NLRB will likely become more employee-oriented. But even so, you know, again, with the NLRB and the NLRA, we don't see yet any guidance. We don't see yet any decisional precedent. One thing that I do want to highlight for private employers is that even if you don't have unions, the NLRA can still be implicated in what we call Section 7, or concerted action organizing activities of your employees. So for example, if your employees were to organize around protesting about a vaccination policy, or protesting because not everyone in the workplace is being required to be vaccinated, those are activities that can be seen as Section 7 activities. So if you're a private employer, before you take any kind of action against those employees who may be expressing protest with respect to vaccines, you need to consult with legal counsel. That's really the takeaway, to continue to consult. Arlene?
Oh, Camille, there was also a question about public agencies that do not have unionized workforces. So would they be in a similar situation to private employers without unionized workforce?
Yes, if for public agencies who are not represented, then the issues about MOUs it makes it much simpler if you're not represented. But I'm going to say, even so, you need to consult with legal counsel before you move ahead in unilaterally implementing your vaccine policy. We're more than happy And on our team, we also have Jessie Ladd, who many of you know as an expert in this area, in assisting any agencies, whether you have unions or not, in putting together a policy that we think will withstand challenges. The last thing that I want to say on this is that if you have collective bargaining agreements or MOUs, check them immediately for a zipper clause, because the zipper clauses may already prohibit a required vaccine policy, or they may allow it. Zipper clauses generally in a labor contract are those that make that contract the exclusive statement of the parties' rights and obligations. So if you have a zipper clause, the vaccine conversation may be zipped out, or it may be allowed. So check your MOUs immediately, and certainly consult with legal counsel on every step regarding this. As we indicated, right now, the essential employees, the employees who are in the highest essential tier, which are public safety workers, police, firefighters, EMTs, paramedics, hospital workers. These individuals, we are seeing a 10 to 20% refusal rate of these individuals who have already been given access to the vaccine. So if you are planning any kind of policy, you need to be reaching out to your unions, and you need to be reaching out to legal counsel so that we can help you navigate through these issues.
As we move to the next slide, there's a question that says, does the survivability rate of COVID, which is represented here in the question as 99% for most age groups, impact the determination of whether an unvaccinated individual constitutes a direct threat to the health of others?
I think that it might play a role, but I think just the fact that, like, we have a client who talked about, they have workers who are doing shipping things out, and they're working in a warehouse. If someone gets sick and then everyone else is exposed, and then everyone has to be out for 2 weeks while they're determining whether they've been infected, that's going to be a direct threat. Even if you can't, even if they don't die from it, it's going to affect everyone else, and it's going to affect your workforce and your ability to operate. So I think it might play a role, but there are other factors that you want to consider as well. I think we're going to move on to the practical considerations now.
We have another poll.
Oh, okay.
Wonderful.
So this is a great one. This is for each of you individually. If there was a vaccine available to you, would you get it? Wait, definitely won't get it. I've already gotten it. So please fill this out. And I think Arlene is smiling at me because I sound like a game show host.
I'll take it. But maybe in the meantime, we can move on to the practical considerations. So we can, okay. This is it. There have been some surveys already, and this is what other people have said, where most people, 40% would wait. But that's not this crowd, I guess.
This crowd is an early adopter. 69% said they'd get the vaccine ASAP. We have a 9%, only 11 people have already received it. Lucky for you. And there's a few that won't get it. So this is our group is a little different than the group of the prior group that's in late 2020, and maybe people's comfortableness with the vaccine has maybe changed people's point of view. Next slide.
So these are some of the practical considerations that we haven't gone into in great detail, but one thing that employers would need to keep in mind, if the vaccine is mandated, then their wage and hour considerations. Just like there's been a series of litigation talking about, for example, if someone has a bag check going in and out of the facility, then that time must be paid for. Similarly, if you were requiring people to go and get a vaccine and that took hours of their time, that likely would be required to be paid time. So there are wage and hour considerations that you would need to think about when it's mandatory. There are also considerations about when people have side effects from the vaccine. Either there could be catastrophic side effects, or what we've heard about more recently is just people who maybe need a day or two to recover from the vaccine, and whether that would require paid time off. Certainly, if you were requiring it and someone was injured or needed time off, then it's much more likely that the employer would be responsible. And Camille and Janice, do you have other things you wanted to bring up?
I just wanted to express, I know that, you know, again, this is maybe a little premature. You know, the vaccine is not widely available yet. So we're talking about policies that would be implemented, you know, potentially for most, I think for many organizations, policies that would be implemented or could be implemented, you know, when the vaccine becomes more widely available, you know, and when the emergency use authorization is no longer a factor, which may be, you know, into summer, maybe into fall. But I know that a number of our public employers are already dealing with issues, not necessarily about vaccine, but about, you know, the PPE, about people wearing masks, and whether or not folks can be disciplined for not wearing masks. And we've got, you know, a number of those issues going on with some of our current clients. And it is a complicated process because of having to show just cause with respect to those employees who are unionized. So, you know, again, I would say, not to be sounding like a broken record, but you know, these are all decisions that we need to consult with you with respect to how to move forward effectively and in compliance with your you know, with your agreements, hopefully to avoid grievances and hopefully to avoid unfair labor practice claims. So we're definitely available to help with these things, but we want to carefully look at your MOUs and due process concerns with respect to any corrective action that's anticipated, not only with respect to vaccines potentially in the future, but in particular regarding PPE and questions of that nature.
And let me just also indicate that by some of the questions being asked that are asked in the chat room and the question and answer component, some of these are specific questions relating to your specific policies and relate to your specific type of employer. So we don't want to give a one size fits all answer to any of these. As both Arlene and Camille have said, this is new law. We don't have any cases that's interpreted it, or very few. So we're trying to find our way through this in a way that minimizes risk for all of you. But given that, let me ask you the question that's been posted. When you reference paid time off for vaccine side effects, if vaccination is mandatory, are you referring to the employee using their PTO hours or getting paid by the employer without using accrued sick and vacation time?
I think it could depend. I mean, it would. So, for example, if the employee had no paid leave, and the employer, I mean, I think you're opening yourself up to claims. There's some litigation risk if you don't provide paid time off to people who need to recover from a mandatory vaccine. But I don't know if it's a settled issue. I don't know if Camille or Janice had other ideas.
This would likely be covered in the MOUs for our public employers. If we're requiring someone to get a vaccine, then, you know, you're going to be paid for that time. So, and the time for, you know, if you're ill as a result of that, that's going to be paid time.
Yeah, and I want to also say that what we're dealing with here is not only a litigation risk, but a brand risk. As you know, a lot of the things that the lawyers here, Camille and Arlene, are talking about are newspaper articles. So as soon as somebody does something unique, it gets put out into the public, and the public then has to, the entity that made this decision has to defend this, not only from a legal perspective, but also for a brand perspective. So we're just suggesting that you take your time and be generous of spirit with respect to giving people time off with respect to these issues, because if you're faced with a claim, you may not look as good denying these type of opportunities for people to take paid time off.
Shall we move on to the next section?
Oh, privacy issues. Here in California, one of the things that we've been talking about in some of the issues that Arlene has highlighted regarding the EEOC kind of highlights the pressure between federal law and state law. And this is part of the confusion around vaccine policies and, can you mandate this, can you not? When the EEOC came out with its guidance, the implication was that, at least from the EEOC's perspective, as long as employers comply with accommodating disabilities and accommodating religious objections, that mandatory vaccine policies do pass muster. And even if that's true, we don't know, as I said, because it's not tested yet, we don't know whether or not that is true or is going to be true. Employers have to be aware that, even if we say that mandatory vaccination policies could be upheld under federal law, in California, we still have to deal with state law. And privacy considerations are very prevalent in California state law. Next slide, please. Okay, well, here's another is this okay question. I don't think that this is accompanied by a poll, but these are all real life examples of some things that some employers have implemented with respect to identifying or tracking who among their workforce has vaccines. So requiring unvaccinated employees to wear a sticker. Circulating a list of vaccinated or unvaccinated employees, and storing vaccination records in an employee's personnel file. And so the question is this okay? And the short answer is no, no, and no. California recognizes the right to privacy, which arises from our state constitution. And in general, to survive a privacy challenge, an employer needs to demonstrate that its vaccination policy is justified by the public interest and by the employer's legitimate business interests. Also, California employers have some additional notice requirements, to explain to employees what kind of personal information is being collected about them for business purposes and how it would be used in connection with a required vaccine policy or vaccine policy. So if an employer were to implement a policy of tracking compliance with vaccines and determining what kind of proof of vaccine is going to be required, needs to be carefully planned with your legal counsel in advance of creating that kind of policy. Because any employee medical information that is obtained by the employer needs to be treated as a confidential medical record under the ADA. And as the ADA requires, such confidential medical records need to be maintained in a separate file, separately from accessible personnel files. One of the things that is important, I think, is for employers to continue to follow pending legislation. We understand that California is likely to be considering vaccine-related legislation that's going to provide additional clarity about the privacy obligations of employers with respect to maintaining vaccination records. And I understand that the CDC is planning to give out these I'm vaccinated buttons for people to wear as part of a kit, like vaccination kit for after people get vaccinated, that they'll be able to wear this button, you know, like the button you wear that says I voted, that says I'm vaccinated, as part of a larger CDC education program and encouragement program, encouraging people to get vaccinated. But that's very different than making unvaccinated people wear a sticker that advertises their medical status. The ADA and FEHA, Fair Employment and Housing Act, discrimination problems there. Also invites disparate treatment of those employees based upon their medical status. So very dangerous in two areas. And, you know, the list of vaccinated employees, again, this isn't something that should be circulated to anyone, because that information needs to be treated as confidential medical records under the ADA. Next slide, please.
While you go to the next slide, I want to just answer a couple of questions. Yes, you can share this information with others. Part of our goal here is to educate as much of the population as we can, and all of you are leaders in your organization, so we do want you to pass this information on. We also want to tell you this is a first in a series. We're going to come back as we learn more about what people are doing and educate you on the next levels, and maybe have a little bit more concrete information as we see these things are applied. And the other question that I had that's not related to the presentation is, can you force people to wear masks if they don't get vaccinated?
So I'm going to, this actually dovetails very well into the next content section on analogies of how different agencies have treated health requirements that Arlene is going to cover. So Arlene, next slides.
So just to kind of review, to see what's going to happen in the future, I think it's helpful to see what's happened in the past. So if we look at vaccinations, and most people should know in California, public and private schools, in-person students must be vaccinated for your regular childhood vaccinations. And since 2016, there's been no personal belief exemptions for students. And that was in part because of that Disneyland measles outbreak. They realized that you need to get as many students vaccinated as possible. But there's no teacher mandate. So that's an interesting issue. Then also California State Universities, vaccinations are also mandated for students, although there were religious accommodations for the flu vaccine. But then in November of 2020, the UC schools said that all faculty and staff and students, if they're going to be coming onto the campus, they need to have a flu vaccine unless there's a medical exemption for disability or religious accommodation. So that kind of just gives us an example of what's happening in the school setting. And then if we can go to the next slide. Right, and then we have also what happens with the hospitals. I found this very fascinating because I thought for sure hospitals who are dealing with sick people all the time would mandate vaccines, but actually that's not the case. There are a number of regulations that require vaccinations be offered, but it's not mandated. So that's just to give you like some background about what's happened in the past. We can't predict necessarily what's going to happen in the future, but this is what's been the situation with other vaccines. And then we can talk about the firefighters and police. I believe that's coming next with Camille. Oh, no. Okay. We're going to talk about alternatives to mandates. So something that you'd want to think about is if you're not going to do mandates, how about incentive programs? So if we can go to the next slide, we see some headlines that we've seen recently about recent vaccine incentives. So there's everything from providing several hours of pay, a gift card for $25. Some have said they would do $75. And so, or there's childcare, paid time off. There's a whole range of things that we're seeing where private employers are providing incentives for their employees to get the vaccine. We haven't seen this really happen with public employers yet because, as Camille mentioned, there are collective bargaining agreements or a memorandum of understanding, and they'd be required to have some meet and confer processes before having any sort of incentives. And also there would have to be considering the use of public funds. Can public employers use their funds to provide these incentives? So those issues would need to be considered. But if we can go to the next slide, I just want you to keep in mind that if you have a vaccine incentive program, this is likely to be considered a wellness program. And they're under the ADA, employers are allowed to have voluntary wellness programs. And so then the question is, what's voluntary? And this has been an issue that has been kind of hanging out there for the last number of years. A few years ago, the EEOC came out with regulations which said that if you have a 30% discount for health insurance for incentivizing people to have certain behaviors, that was okay. It was challenged, and that regulation was struck down in the district court. So then just last month, the EEOC came back and proposed new regulations, and it's very different because the only example that they provided as something that would be considered voluntary incentive was a water bottle or a gift card. So that's, kind of going in the other direction. Of course, this is just a proposed rule, so it's open to public comment and it may change by the time it's actually finalized, but just something to keep in mind. If you're going to have incentives, you need to proceed carefully and think about whether this is going to be considered voluntary. And then if we can go to the next slide. I think Camille was going to talk about educational programs.
So education programs are being used already by a number of you. We've heard quite a bit of feedback from a number of, especially our public employers, who are using education programs together with voluntary compliance. And education programs can be highly effective. If you decide as an employer that you want to encourage but not mandate vaccinations, one of the things that you can consider in terms of creating an education program is first just providing the information to the employees that is factual, trustworthy information about COVID-19 vaccinations that is based on recommendations from state and federal health authorities. The purpose of the program is really about giving the employees the information to care for their health and safety and the health and safety of their coworkers and of the public, and to get them to answer their questions. As we've indicated, there are a lot of individuals who have questions about the safety of the vaccines, not only because of the emergency use authorization, but because there are a number of individuals well before the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines and well before the COVID pandemic who had questions about the efficacy and safety of vaccines in general. So answering questions, providing information, particularly as the updates are coming in with respect to the new vaccinations available. There's also a Johnson & Johnson vaccine, which is coming very shortly, which will be a single dose vaccine. This type of information provided to employees is very essential in terms of getting them to voluntarily buy in to the benefits of participating in a program. Employers should be providing multiple, regular, consistent communications to the employees about the vaccine, not just a one-shot thing or just a one-shot website. Often those are together with a wellness discussion or wellness program.
I wanted to also just point out these images that we have here come from the CDC. The website that's listed there has has PowerPoints and those stickers that could be printed out, and there's a lot of other educational materials that are available to employers. Right now it's focused on essential workers, but I expect over time it will be expanded.
And you know, as time passes and more people get vaccinated, you know, the public's understanding and you know the workforce's understanding of the safety of the vaccines, the efficiency of the vaccines will resolve most likely over time. But education is a program that can be very effectively utilized along with voluntary compliance to encourage employees to comply voluntarily with vaccines. Next slide.
I have a question. Are we required now to educate our employees on the vaccinations, or is it more of a recommendation that that's what we should do?
There isn't a requirement, like a legal requirement to educate employees, but I think that most employers are coming from the place of, you know, we're in a pandemic. We want for the employees, whether they're in the tier of essential workers or of workers who, you know, can work remotely, to be healthy and to take care of their own health and safety and create a safer workplace. So that it's to our benefit, is to the employer's benefit to do that. I mean, one of the questions that comes up most frequently, I think, with respect to vaccinations is this tightrope that employers have to walk between, do I require employees to get vaccinations, or how do I balance between the need to have employees vaccinated, or, you know, concerns regarding that, versus employees who are saying, I don't want to come back to work until everybody is vaccinated. I don't feel safe at work until all of my coworkers are vaccinated and that's been verified. And so, you know, for employers to voluntarily adopt education programs is one way to deal with this, with the balance that employers have to make in that regard.
And I also think, go ahead, Arlene, I'm sorry.
Oh, I could see that there could be in the future some requirement, just like employers are mandated to provide sexual harassment training or to provide information about masking in the workplace. I mean, there's a possibility there could be requirement, but there's nothing right now.
And just from a practical standpoint, given that we're all in this COVID environment where people are working at home, people are working in the office, people are working all over, anything that you can do to enhance employee engagement by educating them is something that we recommend to help with morale with respect to your employees as well. We can go to the last slide, but let me just say one other thing. Over 176 people were on this webinar, which indicates the interests in this topic and how important each of you are to share the information that we're sharing with you. The more people we educate, the more people who understand what the risks are, what the considerations are, the better we'll be as a community. I believe this is our last slide, and this is sort of the final point of what we want you to do after listening to this program. And if you need our help, please call us. But I think that Camille and Arlene, you can summarize these issues because this is sort of the bottom line that we want everyone to take away.
So with respect to the first point, you know, we review your policies, review your MOUs, review your collective bargaining agreements and your personnel policies, and consult with legal counsel to identify the issues that are facing your agency or your company or your organization, and for us to be able to assist you to create a policy that navigates around this landscape as the law is developing, as we're waiting for guidance, as we're waiting for decisional precedent. We're all going to be navigating through this together. And so it's very important to review the documents that you have so that we can start identifying your issues. And I guess also making sure you have training for your managers and supervisors is going to be important.
So for instance, these issues related to privacy about who has the vaccine and who doesn't, it's not intuitively obvious that this information has to be private. So there's going to need to be training to make sure that people understand what the rules are so that you don't inadvertently walk into a lawsuit.
Let me just say thanks, everyone. It was a great, robust conversation. I tried to manage the chat room and ask questions of the group. As you can see, it's a ton of information. Someone asked us about Myers-Naves process, and we're still trying to figure it out just like the rest of you are. And we're having these conversations. We have some protocols in place that you have to tell where you're going, and they ask some questions to make sure that you're not contagious with the flu, and if you've traveled and all those kinds of things before you go into the office. But what just the bottom line of this presentation is I want to thank Camille and Arlene for doing such a fantastic job with answering questions on the fly and really just helping us become more educated on the topics. I also want to thank Stephanie Hill, who did an excellent job of managing all of these things and getting all of us lawyers to be more technologically savvy. She does a really fabulous job. And thank all of you that are on the call that have participated. And I want to answer just the last question about if there's a bad reaction to a vaccine, do you think the employer will be held responsible? And my response is yes, I believe that's probably the safest approach. But if either of you have anything more to add to that answer, how do you feel about that, Arlene or Camille?
Well, I think it's likely a workers' comp issue.
That's exactly what I was about to hit.
Yeah.
Hit the return to say exactly that. Stephanie, thank you very much. Can you just wrap it up for us and let people know what materials they're going to receive so that they can share this with others if they'd like to?
Yes, of course. So we are going to take the rest of today and work on editing the recording for you guys, post a link to our website along with a copy of the PowerPoint. Of course, we will be also working with our MCLE provider to get those certificates out to you guys as well for those that requested it. So bear with us, give us about 24 hours to turn these things around on the back end. And I just want to point out, we do have our presenters' information here up on the screen, and I will also add that to the email that goes out to you when we have all those materials available. So thank you presenters, and to our attendees who were able to make it today. A lot of information, and we look forward to coming back with some updates to this topic.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you.